welcome, teachers, to our 13th episode, where we shall address the topic of globalization, technology, and participation in world affairs with our very special friend and guest of the Constitution of American Life, Liza Prendergast, Vice President of Democracy International. Welcome back, Liza. How you doing?
Thank you so much, Dave. I'm great. Happy to be here.
Great. I hope you'll feel that way in about an hour. Anyway, so, I've kind of done this. It's a new tradition, update on America since we last talked to students in the We the People program. Who would have thought the Texas Rangers and Arizona Diamondbacks are in the World Series, revealing that the baseball gods have no love for any member of the Friends of Publius? Yes, all of our teams are sitting home in their living rooms watching the World Series. And I don't know how I feel about that. Well, I know how I feel about that. I don't know how they feel about that. Anyway, another mass shooting in America, this time in the state of Maine. And according to political leaders from both parties, not caused by access to guns. Hopefully we'll get a chance to talk about that at some point. And yes, we have a new, no. I did want to point out, Matthew Perry died at the age of 54. For those of you young people who don't know, but I did read an article that, a lot of young people do watch, or stream the TV show Friends. Matthew Perry was one of the actors on Friends, but that's not why I'm pointing this out. Matthew Perry was also on my favorite show, West Wing. He had 3 episodes on West Wing as the character Joe Quincy, which I thought, in fact, was one of my favorite characters. And so I take a moment to reflect and think about Matthew Perry and his great contribution to American culture. And yes, moving on, we do have a new Speaker of the House. After 21 days, we now have a Speaker of the House, and I would love to have this speaker on the Friends of Publius program. He is Mike Johnson from the state of Louisiana, and he has a very interesting view of American constitutional history and the American constitutional system. According to the speaker, Johnson, we don't live in a democracy because a democracy is like 2 wolves and a lamb deciding what is for dinner. We live in a biblical republic. The founders did not want a democracy because they followed the biblical admonition of what a civil society looked like. I would love to talk to Professor Tim more and more about that, but that's just what's in the news and for what people to think about. So, as mentioned before, go ahead, Tim.
It is interesting. That came up last Friday on the NewsHour, and David Brooks, a conservative, made the comment. I know, Chris, hang in there. Brooks made the comment that he mentioned this, that Johnson's been heavily influenced by this guy named David Barton, and then went on to say that Barton's very influential amongst evangelicals, and he used the word been peddling a patently false view of early American history, and so Brooks was in an even-handed way. He had a lot of concerns about that, and I would share that view too, but. The root of it is this David Barton guy that's been circulating for 20 years now around.
Yeah, Politico and some other organizations had some really interesting articles about that organization, David Barton, and things. My wife wants to talk to you about evangelicalism at one point, at some point, Tim.
So I'm the token evangelical, huh?
No, I don't know if you are or not, but she's trying to get a grasp of what that word means in the 21st century. So, and amongst the 4 of us, you're the one to go to. Sorry about that. Anyway, so as mentioned before, in today's segment, we are going to be discussing globalization. It's probably a good idea that we begin our conversation with a general understanding of how globalization is defined. So here's the definition I came up with for all of us to play around with. Don't have to agree with it, but we're going to play around with it. It is used to describe the growing interdependence of the world's economies, cultures, and populations brought about by cross-border trade in goods and services, technology, and flows of investment, people, and information. Rather long, but that's the best I could do with the week of research I was able to to do. And what I found fascinating as I did that research over the past week is that when I would Google, all right, globalization plus social justice plus transnational activism, the overwhelming majority of sources focused on the need to bring down the forces of globalization. So I found that rather interesting given the topic that we're going to be discussing today. So this is probably, and again, I think probably the best representation of that was I read an article regarding Amy Chua's The World on Fire, where the author argued that Chua believed that when free market democracy is pursued in the presence of market-dominated minority, globalization and the attempt to democratize the global community has created more instability, ethnic conflict, and mass migration patterns. So hopefully in the time that we have together here in the next hour, we will be able to discuss some of these issues. However, I want to start off with my own little issue here, and that is we're not formal representatives, but our whole program is based upon the We the People, the Citizen, and the Constitution program. And the query in this unit is what challenges might face American constitutional democracy in the 21st century. So this is a question to all of you, and whoever wants to jump in. Can any or all of you explain where I find the American Constitution, its structure, principles, or values in this question? Who wants to jump in?
I will.
Thank you.
I think in a lot of ways, Unit 6 takes Unit 1 concepts and puts different spins on it. So when I first saw this question, I thought, well, this kind of really is this question about globalization and connectedness in that kind of world. I thought it kind of circles back to the question, is classical republicanism and small scale communities, what's the scale of the polis? I mean, that's a question in Unit 1. What is the scale of the polis? So in some ways, I think this question about globalization circles back on that question of, is there such a thing as a polis? What's the definition of polis, and how extensive can it be? So I think it does relate to some issues, although not straight up constitutional, but I do believe it focuses, refocuses and frames the question about polis and size and connectedness of Unit 1.
Anyone else?
I would jump in and say maybe lesson 38 in the textbook, the challenges of participation in world affairs. I mean, there's a lesson in the We the People text that somewhat, kind of relates to this, but in terms of the constitutional issues, I'm having a hard time connecting the dots on that, other than, if our government is going to take action, where within the four corners of the document do you find the power for them to be able to step out into the world? And I think for some of my students in the past, I've always thought about, you think about, if you think of the nation as a person, kind of going on with what Tim was talking about, the polis, if you think of the nation as a person, how should we conduct ourselves in the world of people, of other nations? So what role do you see your nation playing in the world? And actually, I did something with my students. Actually, one original idea last year turned out to be a pretty good idea for some of my younger students to explain not only the supply chain but globalization. Had everybody in the class stand up, and if they were comfortable, let the person behind them look at their tag in their shirt to see where their shirt's from. Right. And, we had a really quick geography lesson then to explain to them, how did your shirt make it to a shelf of a place here in Bismarck, North Dakota from Nicaragua, from Bangladesh? First of all, where is Bangladesh? So, find it on a map. How does your shirt that your person in front of you is wearing, how do they make it from point A to point B with lots of, as we know, lots of points in between? That really helped them understand the whole nature of, one, supply chain, and two, a little bit more of globalization, and the idea that we're trading with multiple countries around the world consistently, and you don't even know it, but most of your clothes are not even made here in this country. They're made in Vietnam. They're made in other countries or south of us or to the far east of us.
So, Mike and Liza, I'm going to focus this next question to the two of you.
Dave,
yeah,
before you do, can I respond to your question about the Constitution?
of course.
Or this one relates to Constitution, because where I went to with the question, and specifically the U.S. Constitution, is Article 2, Section 2, and thinking about treaties and how treaties are made in the United States, and advice and consent that has to happen in the Senate. And I think one of the interesting things that, if I were a student, I would be interested in looking at the treaties that the U.S. has not actually ratified. So the one that I think is one of the most interesting is the Rome Statute that established the International Criminal Court. U.S. has not ratified the ICC, and the ICC is used to investigate and prosecute those responsible for gross human rights abuses, for genocide. And I think it's really interesting to grapple with the idea of sovereignty, because obviously in the US, the Constitution is the supreme law. But the idea of treaties having potentially contradictory or statutes that don't necessarily conform to the US Constitution would require either that they do or that the Constitution is amended. So I think it's really interesting. If I were looking at this question and how it relates to kind of globalization and how we're governed, I would look at treaties both that the US has signed, but I think some of the more interesting ones are the ones that the US has not, and sort of investigating why the US has not signed them.
I had something to add as well. I think that spirit of the question is, how is the American constitutional system challenged by what's going on in the rest of the world? And I think from the very beginning, the United States has not been immune to what's happening in other parts of the world, and it's affected both, I think, our big C and small c constitutions. There was an enormous amount of conversation and sharing of ideas and principles between those involved in the Indian struggle for independence, and those in South Africa struggling for independence, and those in the United States struggling during the civil rights era. And that sharing, it may not be in the text of the Constitution, but I think those struggles still matter. And also, I would answer it by saying, we've had some debates within the Supreme Court, right, where I think Justice Kennedy brought up what was happening internationally with respect to gay marriage and gay rights, and Justice Scalia vehemently shot back and said we shouldn't care what's going on internationally. But I think that depends on who the justices are on the court, and justices could be looking at what's happening in other constitutions to guide them on the American Constitution, if that was the way that they thought that was a legitimate way of interpretation.
So to Mike and Liza, I just want to make sure, are you guys on board with the definition I used with globalization, or the definition I used regarding globalization? Would you diminish or enhance in any way there? And what is your meaning of, in the question that the students have to deal with, what is your understanding of the meaning of participation in the main question? Is it individual participation, or is it collective participation, all right, in international affairs there? So I know that's it's a layered question. One is the definition I presented on globalization, does it address your understanding? Two, what's the meaning of participation in the question that the students have to deal with? there, and are they? And to kind of further clarify that, is that question dealing with group, organizationals, or individual participation? So turn it over to you guys, Mike or Liza.
You want to take the first shot, Liza?
Yeah, I think Dave, I think your definition works. I might add, which is where Tim started us, that I think there is also a kind of interdependence of political systems in a different way. And I think one of the ways we're seeing this is an interdependence of authoritarian systems in kind of a strange way, that they're learning from each other. And it's really interesting to see, for example, how learning across borders for more repressive laws has been quite successful. So there are many countries that have now a foreign agents law, for example. There's many of them have modeled it after Russia's law, but it's trying to criminalize civil society organizing and civil society participation. And it's you can see the model legislation, if you look at it from country to country, that it is, countries are learning from each other. So I think I would potentially add, up for debate, but I would potentially add to your definition that there is kind of a political element, I think, as well. And I think it's similar to democratization, but I think one of the more interesting things to look at is the learning that authoritarians are doing. Before I answer your second question, Mike, do you want to?
Mike?
Yeah, no, I agree with your definition. And I point out to the students though that but this is not your definition, so I'm not claiming you're doing this. It's not a binary. It's not like all of a sudden in the 1990s there was globalization. I mean, that's one of the things I struggled with in teaching this to students early on, was that all of a sudden globalization was a word that was being used, and a lot of students weren't thinking about the history, like the Atlantic slave trade is a form of globalization. Lewis and Clark and encounters with indigenous populations is a form of globalization. So it's a growing intensification of contact between people that could involve economics, politics, and culture. And I think it's, as social beings, there's always been that, but it has expanded, and globalization today is much different than it was in the 90s. And globalization in the 90s was much different than it was at the turn of the century, but it still doesn't mean that term doesn't apply historically. So that's all I would add to that.
Well, so I think Liza wanted to respond. Is it referencing, the question is, what obstacles and opportunities does globalization present for participation in world affairs? Just looking at that question, is that referencing individual participation or large group organizational participation?
Yeah, I read it as either. I think students could tackle it as either individuals or organizations and institutions, and I think it'd be really a quite different response. So, for example, I've been thinking a lot about the idea of citizen assemblies, which I've just been learning about recently, and the idea of like mini publics created. And there's a whole bunch of literature on citizen assemblies, and the idea that there are these, you can create groups of citizens that can give sort of advice either as experts or as just randomly, selected people to individuals in government. There's a lot of sort of cases on this, particularly in Ireland, that have been kind of successful in terms of the effectiveness of this kind of creation to support government officials kind of make decisions that they may not perceive as being popular, but may actually be popular. So I think it depends on how students want to answer the question. So that would be maybe a way for individual participation, as opposed to kind of organizations or institutions, engaging with the UN or kind of at that level of kind of state engagement or civil society engagement, for example, like the work that I do at Democracy International. So I think either would make sense.
That's Liza, that's so good. My examples is more historical, so hopefully this helps. I just
wait, you're going down the path of history? Okay, this is gonna be good.
Jim's rubbing off on you.
But it's Ken Burns history, so it could be the equivalent of like a David Brooks political analysis for some people. But I'm on the record, I love David Brooks. Anyways, I just got finished watching American Buffalo by Ken Burns, which to me is all about globalization, and it's about participating sometimes in ways where there's consent and sometimes where there's not consent. Individuals participating, companies, railroad companies, companies that are wanting bison hides for fur, or beavers fur, and that kind of stuff. And so I see it as that participation can take all those multiple forms, and they've been around since, like I said earlier on, like since very beginning parts of history. And I think one of the issues I think maybe for students is when we think about participating in politics, there's a certain notion of efficacy, like that we have a say. And I think the more you come outside of the nation state, the harder it is to know, okay, where's my vote for some world decision, right? There's the UN, but how do I effectively participate in a decision-making body that's that far removed from the nation state? So we can get into that more, but I think it's different types of participation that may not be have as much efficacy for people, but you can still participate.
So isn't this, I'm sorry, this question seems to be a no duh question to me. If we expand, all right, the perimeters, we're gonna go from nation state to now global community. All right. Isn't it obvious that the opportunities are going to increase, all right, for participation if we increase the foundation of that participation from nation state to global community? Isn't it a no-duh question on at least the opportunities? Mike or Liza?
Yeah, maybe. I think I would buy that. I do think that there's a certain backlash to this, though, in terms of, yes, the way you phrased it, the opportunities, but again, this is very privilege based, right? Like there's an opportunity to go visit someone in Africa, but if you don't have the means to do that, it's going to be very hard. And it's much easier for someone in the United States to go to Africa than for someone like my friends in South Africa to come to the United States. Those opportunities exist, but I do think that there's also a tendency, I think globalization has a tendency to cause a lot of people to be confused and to feel like there's too much transformation, there's too much change, and you hunker down into your own kind of tribal communities or your own silos as well. So while the opportunities could exist, I think we see people not participating less actually because of it.
Well, go ahead, Liza. Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, I think it's interesting when globalization is presented as a dichotomy between either we have globalization or we have kind of, local control, or, and I'm from New England, where we still have, even though at the last national final, some students said, in New England in the 1700s, they used to have small town hall meetings where everybody in the community would go to well, we still do that. We still have local meetings. So I don't think the idea of like, globalization is necessarily that you have to give up political power or give up your ability to participate at the local level. I think there's a dichotomy that is sometimes presented that doesn't necessarily exist. The idea that one country becomes a democracy and another country is also democracy, and you're sort of learning from each other. There are actually a lot of benefits to that, and it doesn't mean that you're giving up your own sovereignty necessarily.
So, Professor Moore, and we've heard some references already, but here's how to me, the question implies that globalization is a fairly modern concept, trend, which presupposes, in my view, that there was a before globalization. All right, that's how I read the question. So if I'm right, what obstacles and opportunities existed for participation in world affairs before globalization?
Well, I think Mike gave the thesis statement. Globalization has been around since, you think about it, the Silk Road and the Spice Road. I mean, that's linking to fairly distant pieces of terra firma. So I think there's globalization that goes back into the early centuries, in common time. We've had, we had the Age of Discovery. And by the way, I think students should think about globalization and the relationship between, is there a pivotal, important piece of technology in each one of these phases? I was at one site where they talked about globalization phase 1, where the technology is ships sail. Global 2 is trucks, globalization 2 would be powered ships. Then you have globalization 3 is trucks, and rail. Globalization 4 is computer and where stuff is being exchanged digitally. So each one of these phases, it goes back in human history. You know, the GATT, I think was in the 80s, where that was a collection of, I don't know, a couple dozen, maybe 30 nations that wanted to create this global market and free trade zones, NAFTA, most famously in our country's recent history. But there's always been resistance to these phases of connecting places around the world. I mean, as I understand it, some of the medieval guilds were not real excited about bringing in all kinds of products into their particular areas of Europe, and so they were successful in putting trade restrictions of what could come into various places in Europe. Of course, mercantilism, I think, in our nation's history, mercantilism is a great break on, although it is the irony is it's a global network of trade, but it all runs through a particular country during the colonial age. And so those trade restrictions pop up whenever there's these expansions. Tariffs are another thing that is used to prevent globalization running rampant. It is interesting to me that Wilson's 14 points, I think it may have been the second or third point in Wilson's 14 points, insisted that there be free and open trade. And so some historians would say, if you want to think about modern globalization, you're going to have to start maybe with Wilson. And I think that's a little too presentism for me, because like I said, this has gone back in history a long time. But there's always been opportunities going back a millennium, and there's always been resistances during those, what I would call, I think Mike used the word intensification, which we may be in one of those intensification moments right now.
Well, I hope we all understand the spirit of my question. I really am trying to help teachers and students here. One, given the nature of Unit 6 and given its unit title, all right, to me, the question presupposes that this is a modern issue. But as you just explained, and then Mike also explained, and again, I like the Silk Road reference there, is that globalization has been around for hundreds and hundreds of years. And so how do we make the distinction here for students and teachers?
I think speed, and that's
is
the
is there a chronology? Is there a timeline where they can play around with?
Well, yeah, there are, and maybe we can find some of those. I've got a couple ideas where to put those in the resource, but I think the speed at which it occurs, and I think that's maybe to Mike's point about intensification. I mean, when you can move zeros and ones around at the speed of digital, that's an intensified global system. So don't miss the technology piece on this that facilitates this movement of stuff.
Mike?
I was thinking,
or Chris? Yeah, go ahead.
well, I was just thinking of a couple of things. Thinking of even, we're so Eurocentric in our viewpoints. If you go back to the ancient Chinese and their trade routes that they had all through India and the Indian Ocean and to the east coast of Africa, and the fact that they decided to stop because they were worried a little bit about the watering down of their own culture, that would have taken on the development of the world may have taken on a much different tenor, right, in terms of like taking their ships across the Pacific at a much greater rate. So the Chinese were involved in the globalization, at least centrally located. I'm going to go all the way back too, though, to David, something that Liza and Mike were talking about. I always think of the slogan, think globally, act locally. That was, that came out, when was that? The mid-90s, maybe about the same time Friedman's book is The World is Flat came out. The idea that, you can think about these big world issues, but again, some people can't travel. They have limited resources, but what can you do locally in terms of what you buy, right?
And there's the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Sorry, just very quickly. talks about the idea of where do human rights begin in the small places close to home.
Yeah.
And it's a global aspirational document. I didn't mean to interrupt you, Chris, but just to reinforce that.
No. I think this spot on. There's a scene in John Adams, the HBO series based on McCullough's book, and I love it. And he and Abigail are sitting there looking at Boston from Braintree, and he's really kind of down. He's really being typical John Adams, and well, don't worry your pretty little head about this stuff, kind of thing. And she had a great line. I don't know that she actually said this, but said a woman makes a political decision every time she goes to the cupboard. Am I buying locally? Am I buying imported? And I just think that was a great line. And I think too, I'm going to, personal story. My son grew up playing soccer year round for about 8 or 9 years, and he wouldn't buy Nike stuff. We couldn't buy him any Nike stuff because he understood where Nike stuff was constructed. It was constructed in India. It was constructed in Bangladesh. It was constructed in Pakistan. He understood what people were getting paid, and he didn't like the idea of supporting that. Now, did Nike suffer because my son, or we didn't buy him Nike soccer balls or Nike boots? No, they're still doing okay. So, the idea of think globally, act locally, what you can do as an individual. Back to your question, David, is this a group or individual? And I would throw out one other person, Greta Thunberg. Here's a young woman that started as a 15-year-old, 14-year-old on her own, sitting outside of the Swedish parliament, holding signs in all kinds of weather. And now she's a recognized person around the world trying to combat climate change. And she started just on her own. I mean, she's not representing or repping any large thing. She's just doing her own thing. So I think there are things you can do individually. Think globally, act locally. But yeah, I think the whole notion of this being a modern problem in terms of globalization it's not modern. It's the navigation acts.
Yeah. Well, I'll offer this up as an idea. Maybe you all will push back. So I think we've all I really do believe that globalization has happened way far back. But if you're looking for that before after, David, here's a possible argument that maybe the before after is 1945. And that's when human beings have created a weapon that can destroy the world. Right? That's a new type of globalization. That at the heels of that, we have the creation of the United Nations, which is the first real effective kind of global participatory kind of thing. I mean, without the United Nations and what comes out of that, Greta has nothing to lobby to other than the Swedish parliament. So maybe a before after for the students to think about is with the first nuclear weapon and then the Soviet Union developing it, then the development of the United Nations, a Declaration of Human Rights, and then everything that flows from that, what Tim was saying from this technology. I guess there's this app called Telegram, right? I'm just watching the news. There's an app called Telegram that spreads ideas, and there's people at Telegram, I imagine, today deciding on what gets on their platform. And some things got on the platform today about a possible Israelis flying into Russia, and there was a riot at the airport.
Yep.
I mean, that's a new that talk about participation in the world, right? Someone sitting from some location could put some sort of misinformation out there and get a horde of people to go to the airport looking to murder Israelis. So I think it's definitely intensified in a different kind of way the last 20 years, but maybe 1945 is that modern, pre-modern line.
Right. And also, I mean, beyond the military, all that, but there are phenomenal economic changes organizationally. I mean, if we look at globalization and the international economic system, international economic organizations are going to really begin post-World War II. GATT and the whole notion of a European Union, although it takes decades to form, is that the seeds are planted in post-World War II, which then relates to the United States and its relations, both areas of the world's relations with Asia, Africa, and Latin America. So, Liza, I think one other issue we have to deal with is this again, this supposition that there is such a thing as a global citizen. All right, which in my mind defies the whole notion of national sovereignty, but that's what makes it a fun conversation. So is there such a thing in your mind as a global citizen, and does global participation equal global citizenship?
Yeah, that's a great question and a really fun one. I think that students should have fun with, because I think yes and no. I mean, you partially answered it, and obviously there are, legal ways that define the rights and obligations of citizens and the rights and obligations of citizens in the US. And there isn't, as this whole conversation has been about, there isn't the same set of sort of overarching laws. And I think Mike did a fantastic sort of introduction to the UN and how that kind of has been effective in some ways at kind of navigating what the post-World War II world looked like, but there isn't a lot of individual citizen engagement in the UN. I mean, there can be, and we can advocate to it, but we're as citizens, we're not necessarily voting for who our representatives are at the UN. It's a much more kind of state to state discussion. But I think one of the interesting things to look at are what are the issues that we are grappling with globally. We touched on climate change. I think another really interesting one is space trash. I think I mentioned this in a previous conversation we had. I think it's one of the coolest, most interesting, understudied issues of what happens to space trash. Who's cleaning it up? Who's responsible for cleaning it up? Is it one country? Is it multiple countries? Is it just the countries that went to space? But we're all kind of weirdly affected by it or not. And I think students sort of grappling with that kind of, space trash as kind of an example of these types of issues that we're dealing with, I think is really fascinating. And by the way, if somebody can figure out a way to deal with the space trash, I think they could also make a lot of money for what like the future of globalization is going to look like. But two other points I'd make that are not quite as fun as space trash. I think one of the issues related to, sort of the definition of a global citizen and why it's important to talk about it is the idea of conflict, of armed conflict and war. And I think students would find it interesting to look at international humanitarian law, which is not something that I'm overly familiar with, but there is a huge body of literature related to the idea of what standards should apply in active conflict and in war. And students may, for example, want to look at, there's something called lawfare that a number of lawyers, including, Ben Wittes and other folks write about international humanitarian law and other concepts. And I think it's interesting because in an issue of active conflict, as we're seeing in the Middle East right now, as we're seeing in Ukraine, who governs, that? And the issue is that no one is governing it. But the idea that civilians should have certain protections in war, that's not necessarily an issue related to what a global citizen is, but it is related to what individual rights we have.
Sorry, I have lawfare right there.
Ready to go.
I was listening to it today.
Excellent. So good reference for this group. And I think international humanitarian law is really interesting. But then on a slightly more positive topic, I think I mentioned the idea of citizen assemblies previously. So, and I think the idea of climate change, which has been brought up, citizen assemblies are being used as one kind of different approach to try to focus on climate change across borders. So the idea of having citizen assemblies in a particular country or mini publics that are kind of advocating for some particular issue that are also working with mini publics in another country and trying to learn from each other. It doesn't negate popular sovereignty, but it is the idea that globally there may be shared issues such as climate change, and may benefit from citizens of different countries sort of learning from each other on that and having a sort of collective advocacy strategy within their own countries.
So, Mike, I got to ask you, as the political scientist, does America's political culture encourage or approve of global citizenship?
I get to say what American political culture is all about?
Yes, you do. You're the political scientist.
Oh, well, then it depends. I think it depends. No, I would say that I think the streak in our political culture is to think much more about our American identity and loyalty to our American identity than to some global identity. I think the field where I work in higher education, I think, is the exception. I think most places of higher education, somewhere on their website, they have something about global citizens. I think most people who are professors would talk about the importance of global citizenship. So I'm in a world where I'm surrounded by that kind of language and that kind of value. But my take on what Americans would think about is what's best for us. And I think you see that playing out. I mean, it's a little polarized right now, but the parties seem to take turns on which side of the issue they're going to be on with different things. But right now, the Republican Party is very much like, what are we giving a dime for Ukraine for, right? And someone who's more of maybe a global citizen would say, I can give you 5 really good reasons why we should be doing that. So on this issue, I think it's the Republicans who would take that stance. I think we could flip it around and Democrats could take a more sort of, I don't know, national identity, patriotic. So what's a little ironic, I find a little ironic about that, if y'all agree with me with that, is that the small L liberalism that makes America America, like the truths of small L liberalism are supposed to be these universal truths. And that's the conundrum, I think. If you really think critically about it, if you really believe that all people are created equal, like if you believe that more than a marketing campaign or something, then you're kind of stuck, because then it really does matter what's happening in Israel, what's happening in Palestine, what's happening in Russia, what's happening in Ukraine. I don't think most Americans are thinking that critically about it. And I'm not saying I think that's where most human beings are at. I think it's easier to be focused on our local and our national than it is the global. But yeah, that's my take on that.
So, Professor Kavanaugh, in my hours of research, I was able to come across the following findings. 34% of U.S. adults think social media has been good for democracy, yet that number rises to 57% if we look at the remainder of the modern democratic nation states. In your opinion, Chris, what factors contribute to this difference towards social media between America and the international community? And does it mean that Americans are less likely to participate because they don't trust social media? Are they less likely to participate in transnational activism?
Well, I think we've already established on previous shows the lack of faith in institutions.
Yeah, but these kids may not have watched previous shows.
Yeah, well, we for the first time viewers, this one of our themes has been the fact that as it stands now, many Americans are losing faith in all different types of institutions, and one of those institutions are clearly government. But David, it's interesting. I'm going to point to Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act that was passed about 30 years ago. Section 230 allows for social media platforms to police themselves. And if you look, and I'm going to share, I found a really interesting article. I'm going to share it in the resources. And what you see in other European nations and Australia and even China and other places, they are much more controlling when it comes to this information and holding these these platforms. They're holding their feet to the fire. And there's an analogy here going back to your very beginning of your show, David, and mentioning what happened in Maine and the terrible tragedy that happened in Maine with shooting. There was a terrible shooting in Australia years ago, mass shooting. And this is a country that relies on its weapons. They have a strong history of gun ownership. But because of this, what did the government do? Led by some conservative politicians, they passed a very restrictive gun ownership legislation. And they've not had mass shootings. They responded to a serious threat, even with the right that Australians enjoyed, and they've not had any more mass shootings. Our reluctance in this nation to deal with that threat, whether it be through mass shootings or through misinformation spread on social media platforms, does not reflect what the rest of the world does. The rest of the world seems to be very intent on, listen, if you put this out here, you're going to, I'll take for instance, libel laws, our country's libel laws. If I was a famous person and a tabloid wrote something bad about me, the burden of proof would be on me. But if I live in Great Britain and one of the local tabs had done something on me, then the burden is going to be on the tabloid to prove it's truthful. And so the libel laws are a little tougher, and that toughness of libel laws has spilled over into and how they police social media platforms. By doing that, I think that gives people around the world a greater trust in what they're reading. There's less misinformation as opposed to what we see here. So I think, and there are a couple of cases, I'm going to put some links and resources that I was not familiar with, one challenging Google and one challenging Twitter, about just that very nature of Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act that was passed about 30 years ago, in terms of, hey, Twitter, police yourself. Meta, police yourself. Google, police yourself. And by the way, there are 41 states now that have brought suit against Meta and Instagram for being the addictive nature of their platforms towards teenagers. So it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out as well. Will we respond when threats have been identified to the common good? And compared to other European nations, we don't respond. I mean, case in point, look at how many mass shootings we have. Once it was okay to kill little kids in Newtown, Connecticut, you knew that the country's not going to do anything about it. Sorry to be so blunt, but it's so frustrating being a teacher and having to worry about that kind of stuff.
I wonder whether there's an analogy, because like the civil rights movement figured out how to use the social media, TV. And I think, some of those images from Birmingham and in other places, TV broadcast those things. And I think, for now, I know the intensification with social media, because everybody has a camera now in their hands, and the ability to, everything's deregulated. But I mean, the media has been used in a couple instances in our history for positive social change.
Yes.
When folks in north of the Mason-Dixon could see this stuff, and Kennedy, was kind of forced into acting. So I just wonder how much of that analogy holds true.
Well, I think Tim, honestly, I think what has changed though is the fact that people trusted Walter Cronkite, and so when Walter Cronkite gets on the news and says he doesn't think Vietnam is winnable, or when you see young kids in Birmingham getting bitten by police dogs.
Now we have 5,000 Walter Cronkites, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and you throw in AI with that and the ability for the deep fakes, and so there's going to be a cynicism with that.
Yeah.
Let me ask you this, Chris. I guess here's my question: is okay. In the original social media, we'll call it television, we had Walter Cronkite, Huntley and Brinkley, and so forth. And I have no clue. Did Canada, England, Australia, Germany, France, did these countries have the same kind of trustworthy figure? And is the problem today that with the decentralization that technology presents to the communication of ideas, news, does that make it impossible for us to have a trustworthy person, an identity, a trustworthy face, that helps build that? I mean, I'm still wondering, why are we less likely to trust social media vis-a-vis the Western European nations predominantly? Why are we less likely there?
Well, I think that's
because we don't have a Cronkite.
Well, no, because you don't have Cronkites on social media. You have influencers, you have people that have large followings, and again, I go back to the idea, and if you look at the regulations put forth by so many other countries around the world to limit what happens and what gets posted within their country, we don't. And so because of that, there's a greater deal of misinformation, but there is a positive idea. I mean, think of like, I don't know, positive, I guess, I don't, depends on your perspective, but go back to what it was called the Twitter rebellion in Egypt, the Twitter revolution. They were using Twitter, that was, was called Twitter, to communicate, to overthrow Hosni Mubarak in Egypt. So there has been social media movements to again, I'm not going to say it's good or bad, but the jury might still be out on that. But I think part of it goes back to the idea, for whatever reason, and I have my suspicions it's about profit. We're reluctant to control media platforms, and you start to see the deregulation under the Reagan administration, obviously with the fairness doctrine. We're reluctant to control media platforms for whatever reason, compared to other European and other nations around the world. It's like, hey, you're going to post this stuff, it better be accurate, because if it's not accurate, then you're going to get fined. You're going to get fined big time. And there are some hefty fines put in place by different countries around the world for when these platforms, whether it be Twitter or Telegram or Instagram or whatever it may be, if you're allowing this free flow of misinformation, we're going to shut it down. We're going to fine you. Which I think allows people to be more trusting of what's put on there.
So, Professor Williams, I think the next logical question emanates from something from Mark Twain there. And I don't know if he's the original ownership of there, but Twain once said that a lie can travel halfway around the world while the truth is still putting on its shoes. And it seems to me that technology has increased the speed of which that can happen 1,000-fold. And according to the Council on Foreign Relations, globalization combined with emerging platforms of social media have become powerful tools for both those who seek to enhance freedom as well as those who seek to limit freedom. And so my question to you is this a good trade-off? All right, in the sense that this global communication vis-a-vis social media and digital platforms, most definitely, all right, enhance the ability to promote freedom. But we've also seen this very dark side, as I think Twain refers to, and we're very much experiencing right now, especially with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. All right, the misinformation and disinformation that's going around globally, all right, to me makes it impossible, whether I'm an individual global citizen or part of an organization, to confront the problems. And so I'm wondering, is it a good trade-off, as far as having this increased ability to communicate globally? Has that ended up, in your opinion, been a good trade-off?
Wow, that's it.
I know.
It's a good question. It's hard for me to get my head around how to measure it. So I'm gonna say I'm not gonna say it depends. I'm gonna say it's kind of based on the context and what side you're sitting on. So for example, our phones have allowed us all to be citizen journalists, right? We take out our phones, we can videotape things going on in our communities or whatever, put them on social media. Without someone doing that with George Floyd, if CBS or NBC hadn't been driving by, we don't get the sort of legitimate outrage of what happened, right? The same thing, Chris mentioned the Arab Spring, right? And the power of social media to bring down dictators. The power for us to see, not just hear accounts, but to see the accounts of what's been happening in both Israel and Gaza. I think there's a power to the images. Now, how do we balance that against the role that social media, or not social media is a tool. The role of those who would use social media, for example, in the 2016 election, and the misinformation that was there in our own election, the misinformation that happened with the whole debate about Brexit. I don't know. I think Chris is right. I think some of this, we could change behavior just on different institutional and legal frameworks. I mean, the the cat's out of the bag. We're not going to put this back. And in fact, if Tim, what you said earlier about these moments of like demarcation of like what's the main thing? I mean, just today, was it today that Biden issued an executive order on artificial intelligence? And I
Yes.
thought, well, that's good, but where's the executive order on social? Like, we're dealing with the artificial intelligence because we can all kind of see that's what happens when someone else is putting out a friend of Publius a video that's not us, because they can. We say
As
the
long
same
as they
thing.
make me look skinnier, I'm fine with it.
I'm
Okay.
saying. So I think part of it can be institutional legal, and that's just where I think governments have to step up and do that work. And maybe that's where lies we think about world arrangements. But I think part of this is also cultural. And I wonder, this will be the final thing I say. It's going back to the question you asked before, David, about this discrepancy. And I'm just wondering if the correlation there, if we looked into the data, is our political and cultural polarization, has that affected the way we see social media and institutions that is different than Europe? So is it cultural as well as institutional legal, in changing the cultural values around what is appropriate to put it out there for the world to see? It's going to be much harder to change even with certain rules in place.
Well, I think there's a communitarian and libertarian discussion in there. I mean, if a culture is overwhelmingly individualistic and libertarian, your answer is going to be one way. But if it's more communitarian in its outlook, the regs are going to be there.
Ooh.
So I think there's a philosophical, and that's the cultural piece, I think. I mean, to Mike's point, that may be relevant here. Are we more libertarian with technology, or are we more communitarian with?
This might be an oversimplified view, but technology in and of itself is neither good nor bad. It's, I mean, well, okay, easy, Luddite.
Hey Tim, we're together on this.
No. Amusing ourselves to death. I mean, what's that author? I mean, technology isn't neutral. I mean, it all has an epistemology.
Well, no, I would disagree. I would push back. I mean, TNT was technology, right? Dynamite was technology, and it was used to build the most advanced highway system in the world, but it also is very destructive. How is a human using the technology? And whether it be these, right, or whatever it may be, through history, we've had technology. The sextant, was technology. The caravel, the shallow hull boat ship, was technology. How have we used technology? And the idea is we've used it for both good and bad because of human nature.
Right. Here's the problem, Chris, is that, I'll grant you some leeway, 200 years ago, but after so many experiences with technology going bad, at what point does human society have
Technology didn't go bad, David. David, technology did not go bad.
Yes, it did.
No, it didn't. People have used technology to do bad things.
Right. Okay. So, all right.
The technology is not necessarily bad. It's how people are using the technology.
Okay. Okay. We'll agree. So here's my question. At what point does human society, understanding that mankind can use technology for bad, at what point do we try to discuss the uses of technology before the fact rather than after the fact? I.e., we can look at atomic energy, and we can't say, oh, well, we can't do that until we know. Hell, we know that a majority of the atomic scientists
David,
wait.
Relax. I'm not disagreeing with you.
Scientists were all
David,
saying,
relax.
hey,
I'm not disagreeing. I'm not disagreeing with you on that, David, but I'm just saying technology in itself is neither good nor bad. It's human nature. And, I'm going to go back to an argument that somebody on this panel and I had a long time ago, and I've come around to believe the man has not made progress. So, Tim, I'm a convert. That man has not made progress, because you're right, David. Should we, hey, before we blow this weapon up, should we decide, can we control it? before we release AI on the world, should we decide whether or not we should limit its ability to design a bioweapon for somebody?
But our decision not to do so, Chris, is a conscious decision. It's not human nature. All right. It is
well,
a
yeah, it is,
conscious.
David. It is human nature because people are greedy and people are willing to put that out there because they can profit from it greatly. Right. And that is one of the reasons why I think we're reluctant in this country to put regulations on social media platforms, because they have so much power financially and people are reluctant to do that.
Wait, I thought we kind of said that other countries have taken a different tact on that. Did I hear correctly?
Yes.
So are you saying that our nature as Americans is different than the nature of other human beings?
I think to a degree, especially in Western Europe, when you look at, oh yeah.
Oh, wow. This is fun. This is definitely very fun.
David, how many mass shootings have there been in Western Europe? How many mass murders have there been in Western Europe with gun violence?
Well, we know we did have
therein I rest my case. Because why? Because our culture.
I don't think that's nature.
You asked about the difference. You asked about the difference between America and Europe, and in European cultures, you have a greater reliance on the state. I think there's a greater reliance on what we would call civic virtue, because the government has played a greater role in many of these countries for a longer period of time, where we have this idea of the rugged individual, right? The rugged individualism and the whole idea of the cowboy frontier and the whole idea of the individual, which is kind of hogwash in a way, but we buy into that myth of it. So that is, go back to Frederick Jackson Turner. What makes us different than our European ancestors? Our life on the frontier, the rugged individual. So I think there is a differences in culture. So
yeah, no, that may be true. So we need to get to Liza, back to Liza here, and I get back to the question here, and I'll be honest, I taught this program for 16 years, and every year that I did this and went to the state competition, and you'd get the state questions, and there would always be at least one. Whereas in my first reading was, what in the HE double toothpicks are they asking? And this question falls into that category on so many different levels. But there's a phrase there that they use called international norms. All right. Liza, can you, to the best of your ability, explain to me what they mean by international norms?
No, but I can suggest a few areas for students and teachers to explore.
Okay, go ahead.
This is people write theses and books and on this particular topic, but I think in the connection with the earlier conversation related to social media and international norms, I don't see as much of a connection as I do to kind of the politics and kind of economic globalization that we were talking about earlier in the conversation. I think, the idea of international norms are affected by the Soviet Union falling apart, are affected by individuals in countries that were colonized seeking their own independence and self-determination and self-governance. I think those issues and economic issues that you all have touched on no better than I do have much more greatly affected international norms. But I do think I am more in alignment, I was a little bit nervous about this question, with Chris, actually, in terms of looking at social media as kind of tools. And for me, I think of the printing press. I'm a tool? I was trying to agree with you, Chris, but I don't know. Maybe I'll walk that back. No, but much more like the printing press, for example. And I agree with the argument that I think three of you have now made about the idea that we haven't really governed social media in the US and the way that it needs to be governed. And I would encourage students to watch the testimony and watch the reaction of our own legislators in the US to the testimony of the owners of social media, and see if students think that our legislators have the depth of knowledge that they need to actually effectively govern. Because if you look at, except for Telegram that was mentioned earlier, many of the social media giants are based in the United States. It would have to be US or in Ireland, but they would have to be US and Western laws that can govern them, that can, figure out how to grapple with some of the really egregious things that are shared. And I also agree with Chris that I think, the idea of social media as an inherently bad thing, I think that makes me nervous because, for example, you look at the use of social media in Iran to organize people, and you look at the importance of things like, IP masking and using VPNs so that people can access information. That's actually, can be critically important to pro-democracy movements around the world. As it, the attempts Chris mentioned, the Twitter revolution in Egypt. I worked in Egypt immediately in the post-Mubarak era, and young people would literally walk through tear gas to go to, pro-democracy rallies and to try to use, the government did shut down, social media on multiple occasions. And I think there should be a really high bar for that, because it essentially tried to shut down debate. It tried to shut down the idea that, students could gather freely, or young people of all ages, but I was working mostly with young people, could gather freely and have conversations about what they wanted their government to look like. So I think, as we have conversations about how social media should be regulated, because it is global in nature, but these companies are based in, many of them are based in the US or Western Europe, there's also an element of how much you shut down in one environment affects another environment as well. So it's really complicated
Yeah, I
issue.
know. So, Mike, I want to come to you because I think Liza kind of gave us maybe a reference point, and that is World War II. Although I think international norms are trying to be structured post World War One. I don't really believe that they form until post World War II. And I'll call it liberal democracy, and I'll call it some element of liberal capitalism and free trade, and you've got the bipolar world of Western liberal democracy and and then the communist world there. So my my view is that that those norms, all right, developed and strengthened for 50 years, all right, but in the last 25, 30 years, we've seen these norms start to become undone as far as liberal democracy and Western, capitalism and things. Is that maybe is that a legitimate proposition that I'm presenting there?
Yeah, I guess it would just depend on kind of which of the case studies are you looking at, because I could argue that from the 50s and 60s and 70s were not a time where international norms were being recognized by the most powerful countries on earth. I mean, that's the period of history when the United States is going around and forcibly removing democratically elected leaders, and when the Soviet Union is engaged in, subjugating people in Eastern Europe. I mean, the international norms were mentioned, but were they actually enforced? And in the last 25 years, I don't know I don't know if it's any better or any worse. I do know that we have seen, we saw one of the greatest increases in places becoming democracies in the last 25 years. Now, we saw it decline as well. I'm not sure what the role of social media is in that. I just keep coming back to something Tim has said on all these programs, that like, if we really want to talk about what kind of republic we are, we're a commercial republic. And so maybe we need to start thinking about our commercial interests and how that's dictating which international norms are being upheld and which are not. Maybe that's what's explaining these different political outcomes and whether norms are enforced or not. So I don't know. I think I think argument either side. I think it, like Liza kind of just said, this is something that there's dozens of books and articles written on. So I think you could piece together an argument with that different data. And since that we're living in the midst of it, I don't even know how good our conclusions would be. I mean, we could maybe make some conclusions about the 50s, 60s, and 70s about whether that was a time for international norms. So we could make that argument. In the present time, I don't know if we're in a position to do that.
Well, that I think that says it wonderfully. And that's going to be my suggestion and or advice or conclusion to students and teachers who are dealing with this question, and that is, I don't know. There, so feast on that for a minute. As we do to close all of our programs, we look for suggestions and recommendations. And my sense of this question, I was thinking about this question, and it's like going to a shishi restaurant. You know, one of those restaurants that have really, really expensive items, but they give you a little teeny tiny bit on your plate, and you're not satisfied. And that's my sense about this question and my ability to deal with it. Is I got a couple of bites. But I need more. I need to go to a country diner.
You need like a big bowl of ravioli. Is that what you need?
Yeah, I
Big
need a
bowl of
really
ravioli,
big
yeah.
plate of ravioli with meatballs on this. So I gave my recommendations to teachers and students. I don't know, but let's go around the diamond here and get some insights from our scholars. Professor Moore, what recommendations?
I really think Amy Chua's book, World on Fire, is there are some problems with her thesis when you really get into the weeds, but the thesis really is worth considering. Her point is, when you open up democracy and then you insist on free markets, there are people in these places that are positioned to do very, very well, and it makes a lot of people angry. And so if you're really big on globalization, I would recommend, I mean, it's a Curb Your Enthusiasm book. Globalization is not all that it's cracked up to be, because it can create a world on fire, because all these resentments that occur when globalization takes place. So I would really recommend kind of digesting that thesis. That the book's probably 20 years old now, but I think it's very readable, and I think high school, it's very accessible, I think, for high school students. So I would recommend reading that book.
Professor Kavanaugh.
Well, that makes me think of Astrid Taylor's book that I mentioned before, Democracy Never Existed, but We'll Miss It When It's Gone. And I'll put it up in the references, but she talks about this natural conflict between freedom and democracy, right? There's an actual conflict between those. And I think that's so true as redressing. And oh my gosh, I'm all over the place on this. I was listening to Michael speak, and I'm wondering about, obviously with climate change and the greater migration of people, and we're seeing this in European nations, we're seeing it in our nation, we're seeing people moving from places where their situation is untenable to places where they believe they will have a chance of success, and doing that legally as well as illegally in many places around the world. And I wonder what that will bring us in the next 15, 20 years as the climate continues to change. I also think of something else Michael said, and that is the whole idea. Do you either believe that everybody was created equally, or you don't? You either believe that in these Enlightenment ideas that we founded our country upon, or you don't. And that doesn't matter whether you're Jewish or Christian or Catholic or non-denominational or Palestinian or Israeli or whatever. You're a person. And as a person, you're entitled to certain basic fundamental rights. You either believe that or not. And the other thing I'll leave you guys with is back to this idea of being a global citizen. We just took a look at seeing one of my classes a couple of weeks ago, and it talks about the expanse of space. It is I can't wrap my head around how we are just a speck in a speck of a speck of things, and how tiny our own sun is compared to these other suns, and the view of this little dot that we're all riding around on, we call Earth. And that yet as humans, we have to draw lines on maps. We have to come up with flags and anthems and this competition for resources we've been doing since man has walked upright. And it's a little frustrating now that we're, you know, as things are going to get worse, I think before they're going to get better, how do we come together as a world to solve some of our problems? And it's really frustrating because I do believe you can be a citizen of the world. I think it's important for us to be a citizen of the world. And I'm not downplaying my own American citizenship. I'm very thankful for that. But I do believe that we need to take a much zoom out to, you know, miles and miles and miles and miles and look at this little planet that we're all riding around on, because that's all we got right now. And my last thing is, I'm with David. I'm not really sure. I don't know.
Professor Williams.
Yeah, I think I have two things for the students to think about. I think one thing that we didn't bring up is there a distinction between globalization and westernization? And I would encourage you to think about what globalization looks like in the non-Western world and
Yeah.
to evaluate the advantages and disadvantages there. I'll try to see if I think of any resources to put in there for you, but that's just something we didn't bring up, but it's out there for you to consider. And my other point is, like, to get back to David's analogy that we're at this restaurant, these two sub-questions, my plate feels very full with a lot of different things, right? And I would encourage you, like let me just get the question here really quick. Like, facilitating transnational activism. What are the, like, how would you define that? Like, you could take you could talk about that one term, right? And kind of drill down into it. International norms, we kind of talked about, like, what does that mean? Global agendas, like, what is a global agenda and how would one influence that through social media? So I think there's an opportunity as you're talking with your peers and with your teachers to think about your own lived experiences, think about the definitions of these concepts, and think about your own use of social media and how that is relevant to you at all. I think that this is the kind of question where I imagine a lot of judges are not gonna, are gonna be relying upon, what do you, Gen Z, what do you think about this? Since I don't have a TikTok account quite yet, so I would take advantage of that and to share your experiences with these platforms and with your engagement of the world.
Liza.
Yeah, I would end with two book recommendations for students who want to go a bit deeper on sort of the democratization element of globalization, because I think one of the interesting, when I was thinking about this question, I thought about what it means specifically for authoritarian learning, because one of the things I'm quite concerned about in the future is sort of, is representative democracy something that's going to survive long in the future. And I would encourage students to read or to take a perusal, actually three recommendations. One, through Madeleine Albright's book Fascism, A Warning. I think it's really interesting and it grapples with some kind of concerning issues, looking both back at her own experience, having experienced that, and the sort of modern day, and also the book How Democracies Die. Not an uplifting book, but a very interesting one. And then the third thing, there's a Journal of Democracy that's run by the National Endowment for Democracy. It has a number of really interesting articles written by thoughtful academics, people like, if he hasn't done it yet, Mike Williams, who are experts on issues like South Africa, for example. But I think it's really interesting, and it provides some sort of comparative articles on, topics that students might be interested, countries that students might be interested, to do a kind of deeper dive, as Mike recommended, in sort of non-Western sort of discussions of globalization. And I'll make sure to put those in the reading list as well.
Well, it's been fascinating, and if you walk away with anything, and that is metaphor. Mike's plate is full, but he's still hungry. My plate is shishi, and I'm full, maybe there. So you figure out which metaphor applies to you, students and teachers. when it comes to Unit 6, question 3. Liza, we always enjoy having you as a guest, and we're hoping to that you'll join us for the national questions as they are released there. As always, we hope that you walk away, students and teachers, with some perspective and some thoughts about this question. In our next few sessions that we hopefully will see you, we're going to be talking about the 3/5 clause, always an interesting topic, as well as the influence of British common law and the colonial system under the British rule. So until we see you again, peace, love, yogurt, tacos. Bye bye. Bye bonds.